The Imperium of Man, a vast and sprawling empire that stretched across the galaxy, was built on faith, bureaucracy, and power. Its foundation was a complex web of organizations: the Adeptus Terra, the Ecclesiarchy, and the Administratum, each responsible for different aspects of governance. However, by the 36th millennium, these institutions were no longer working in harmony. Corruption had wormed its way into the heart of the Imperium, and a sense of decay hung over its once glorious machinery. At the center of this bureaucratic behemoth was the Adeptus Administratum, a monolithic organization responsible for managing the countless worlds of the Imperium, ensuring that tithes were collected, orders were disseminated, and resources were allocated. Over time, the Administratum had grown bloated, a labyrinthine entity where inefficiency was often rewarded with more red tape and complexity. It was here, amidst the crumbling hierarchy, that a man named Goge Vandire began his rise to power. Vandire was not a man to be underestimated. He had a keen intellect, a ruthless streak, and an insatiable hunger for control. Early in his career within the Administratum, he demonstrated a cold efficiency that won him allies among those who valued order above all else. Vandire's ability to manipulate the inner workings of the Administratum, to bend its rules and exploit its failings for his own benefit, allowed him to quickly ascend through the ranks. But for Vandire, the Administratum was merely a stepping stone. His true ambitions lay in the Ecclesiarchy, the religious heart of the Imperium. The Ecclesiarchy, or Adeptus Ministorum, was the governing body of the imperial cult, the religion that worshipped the emperor of mankind as a god. Over millennia, the Ecclesiarchy had amassed tremendous power and wealth, and its influence stretched into every corner of the Imperium. The imperial creed was more than just a religion. It was a unifying force, binding together the diverse worlds and populations of the Imperium under the belief that the emperor, even in his deathless state on the Golden Throne, was still guiding humanity. By the time Vandire entered the ranks of the Ecclesiarchy, it was already bloated with corruption. The high-ranking clergy were more concerned with maintaining their power and luxury than with the spiritual well-being of the Imperium's citizens. Yet the Ecclesiarchy's control over the faith of billions made it the most potent weapon in the Imperium's political landscape. Vandire, with his sharp mind and calculating nature, saw an opportunity within the Ecclesiarchy to seize ultimate power. It wasn't long before Vandire manipulated his way into a position of prominence within both the Administratum and the Ecclesiarchy, a feat that would have been unthinkable for most men. But Vandire was no ordinary man. His ruthlessness, cunning, and ability to eliminate rivals meant that he quickly consolidated his hold on both organizations. The title of High Lord of Terror, the de facto ruler of the Imperium in the Emperor's stead, fell into Vandire's hands, giving him control over the largest civilian and religious organizations in the galaxy. The key to Vandire's rise was his mastery of fear and control. His first act as High Lord was to purge the ranks of anyone he deemed a threat to his rule. In secret trials, he ordered the execution of countless rivals, while others simply disappeared into the dark halls of the Administratum, never to be seen again. Even those who had once supported him found themselves under scrutiny, for Vandire trusted no one. His paranoia became legendary, and no position in the Imperium was safe from his reach. Vandire's rise to power marked the beginning of an era that would come to be known as the Reign of Blood. His absolute authority over both the religious and bureaucratic arms of the Imperium allowed him to impose his will with unprecedented brutality. His purges extended across the galaxy, as worlds that failed to meet their tithes or showed signs of disobedience were brutally crushed. Vandire was not content to rule from the shadows. He demanded total control, and his regime quickly became synonymous with terror. It wasn't enough for Vandire to simply hold power. He sought to be seen as a divine figure, a living extension of the Emperor's will. This desire to elevate himself above mere mortal rulers drove him to cultivate a cult of personality. The propaganda machines of the Ecclesiarchy and the Administratum were put to work, spreading the message that Vandire was the chosen of the Emperor, the only one capable of steering humanity through the dark times ahead. In the eyes of the faithful, Vandire was presented as a savior, and his image was raised to near godlike status. Amidst the growing chaos, rumors of rebellion began to spread. Whispers of resistance flickered across the Imperium, but few dared to openly oppose Vandire. His power, after all, seemed unassailable. Yet the seeds of defiance were being sown, and it was only a matter of time before those seeds would grow into something that even Vandire's iron will could not suppress. As Goge Vandire's reign stretched on, the once mighty Imperium groaned under the weight of his tyranny. His paranoia and thirst for control had grown beyond even his own ability to manage, and the constant purges, executions, and demands for unwavering loyalty from every corner of the galaxy left the Imperium teetering on the edge of collapse. Entire star systems had been reduced to ruin in his name, their people slaughtered or enslaved, and even the most devout followers of the Imperial Creed began to question the divine mandate of this self-proclaimed ruler. Beneath the surface of the Imperium, the flames of rebellion began to flicker and grow. Vandire's heavy-handed methods had alienated even the most loyal factions of the Imperium's ruling elite. The Adeptus Mechanicus, responsible for maintaining the Imperium's technology and war machines, had grown increasingly frustrated with Vandire's impossible demands. They saw no reason to waste precious resources on Vandire's endless campaigns of terror, and their once stalwart support of the Ecclesiarchy began to wane. Similarly, the Space Marine chapters, the Emperor's Angels of Death, watched from the sidelines as the Imperium fell deeper into ruin. The Astartes had not intervened thus far, as their loyalty was to the Emperor, not the shifting tides of imperial politics. However, Vandire's ever-increasing demands for loyalty and his reckless use of the Imperium's military forces were starting to fray even their patience. The galaxy was at a breaking point, and while the Astartes had held back for fear of becoming embroiled in the corrupt politics of terror, they knew they could not stand by forever. In the shadows of terror itself, resistance was quietly taking shape. High-ranking officials of the Adeptus Terror, those who had survived Vandire's brutal purges, began to meet in secret. Their numbers were few, and they knew that a direct confrontation with Vandire's regime would be impossible. His control over the Ecclesiarchy and the Sisters of Battle was too absolute, and any overt opposition would result in swift and brutal retribution. But as Vandire's madness deepened, his enemies grew bolder. Whispers of rebellion turned into covert acts of defiance. Supplies intended for Vandire's armies mysteriously disappeared. Messages were sent across the stars, calling for the scattered remnants of the imperial government and military to unite against the despot. Though the Imperium's people still feared Vandire's wrath, they had begun to see him for what he truly was, a tyrant, unworthy of the Emperor's blessing. Vandire, of course, was aware of these rumblings of dissent. His network of informants and spies stretched across the Imperium, and he responded to each whisper of rebellion with swift and terrible violence. Yet for all his cruelty, the cracks in his regime were beginning to show. His constant need for control left him increasingly isolated, surrounded only by sycophants and zealots who were too afraid to tell him the truth of the galaxy's crumbling state. His paranoia reached new heights. Believing that his enemies were conspiring against him within the heart of terror itself, Vandire ordered ever more extreme measures to root out potential traitors. The halls of the Administratum and Ecclesiarchy ran red with the blood of those who were deemed insufficiently loyal. Vandire's grip on power, once seemingly unbreakable, had become a death spiral of madness and destruction. It was during this time that one of the most significant and unlikely figures in Vandire's downfall emerged. the mysterious and enigmatic Sebastian Thor. Thor, a man of immense charisma and faith, was a simple preacher who had risen through the ranks of the imperial cult. His message was one of hope and redemption, and he preached that the emperor's true will was not reflected in the actions of Vandire's corrupt regime. Thor's sermons began to spread across the Imperium, reaching even the most isolated worlds. With his iron grip on the Imperium secure, Vandire turned his attention to fortifying his image as the ultimate authority. The machinery of the Ecclesiarchy was perfectly suited to this task. The common people of the Imperium, most of whom had never set foot on Terra or even knew the true extent of the Emperor's decrees, were easy prey for religious manipulation. Vandire exploited this vulnerability to its fullest extent, presenting himself not only as the protector of the faith, but as the Emperor's divine mouthpiece. Under Vandire's reign, the line between the Emperor's divinity and his own authority blurred. Statues of Vandire were erected in cities across the Imperium, and his face appeared on devotional icons alongside that of the Emperor. Churches and cathedrals began to incorporate Vandire's name into their liturgies, and sermons preached that loyalty to Vandire was synonymous with loyalty to the Emperor. This was no small feat. Vandire was reshaping the very nature of the imperial creed to serve his own ends. But Vandire's ambitions didn't stop with propaganda. He knew that words alone could not maintain control over an empire as vast and fragmented as the Imperium. He needed a military force that was as fanatically loyal to him as it was to the Emperor, and so he began to build one. His first tool of enforcement was the Frateris Templar, a massive religious militia drawn from the most devout followers of the Ecclesiarchy. These fanatics were armed and trained to wage holy war on anyone Vandire deemed a threat, and they were dispatched to quell uprisings, enforce compliance, and spread Vandire's message of absolute obedience. The Frateris Templar were a blunt instrument, vast in number, but often poorly trained and equipped. However, their zeal and sheer willingness to die for Vandire's cause made them a terrifying force. It was not enough. Vandire sought something more formidable, more disciplined, to serve as the core of his military power. His solution came in the form of the Daughters of the Emperor, an all-female order of warrior nuns who had been raised in secret on the planet of Sanlior. These women were trained not only in the arts of war, but also in absolute devotion to the imperial creed. Vandire, recognizing their potential, took personal command of the Daughters of the Emperor, rebranding them as the Sisters of Battle, the militant arm of the Ecclesiarchy. The Sisters of Battle were the perfect enforcers for Vandire's regime. They were disciplined, fanatically loyal, and utterly devoted to the Emperor. Vandire's manipulation of their faith convinced them that he was the chosen representative of the Emperor, and they followed his orders without question. Their zeal and combat prowess made them an unstoppable force, and they quickly became the spearhead of Vandire's campaigns of repression. With the Frateris Templar and the Sisters of Battle under his command, Vandire's rule of terror spread like wildfire across the Imperium. Planets that showed even the slightest hint of rebellion were razed to the ground, their populations slaughtered in the name of purging heresy. The Imperium, already a harsh and unforgiving place, became a living nightmare under Vandire's rule. His purges were not limited to civilians. Any member of the Adeptus Terra, the Adeptus Mechanicus, or even the Adeptus Astartes who opposed him was swiftly dealt with. Vandire's cult of personality reached its zenith during this period. He demanded not only obedience, but adoration. Those who refused to worship him as the divine instrument of the Emperor were publicly executed, their deaths broadcast across the stars as a warning to others. The Imperium's citizens, already downtrodden and oppressed, now lived in constant fear of being accused of heresy for even the slightest misstep. Vandire's reign became a reign of blood, and the galaxy wept under his iron fist. But even as Vandire's power seemed absolute, cracks were beginning to form in his regime. His paranoia, which had once served him well in eliminating rivals, now grew to uncontrollable levels. He saw enemies everywhere, and his purges became ever more extreme. The sheer scale of the violence and repression he unleashed began to strain the resources of the Imperium. Planets that had once been prosperous and productive were now desolate wastelands, their populations decimated by Vandire's wars of repression. The Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, had remained largely neutral during Vandire's rise to power. However, as the Reign of Blood dragged on, many within the Adeptus Astartes began to question Vandire's legitimacy. They were warriors of the Emperor, not the pawns of an increasingly tyrannical madman. Yet Vandire's control over the Ecclesiarchy made direct action difficult. The Sisters of Battle and the Frateris Templar, with their fanatical loyalty to Vandire, would resist any attempt to challenge his authority. At first, Vandire ignored Thor's growing influence, dismissing him as a mere annoyance. But as Thor's message gained traction and followers, Vandire's paranoia once again took hold. He saw Thor as a threat, a rival who could undermine his divine mandate. Orders were sent out to assassinate Thor, but the preacher had already become a symbol of resistance, and his followers protected him with fanatical devotion. Thor's movement continued to grow, spreading like wildfire through the Ecclesiarchy and beyond. As Thor's message reached the highest echelons of the Adeptus Terra and the Imperial military, a coalition of those disillusioned with Vandire's rule began to form. Thor's faith and charisma provided the rallying point that the scattered forces of resistance needed. Behind closed doors, powerful figures from the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Adeptus Astartes, and even the Inquisition began to plan Vandire's downfall. For the first time, Vandire faced true opposition. But even as the forces of rebellion gathered in secret, Vandire's cruelty reached its zenith. Entire planets were declared heretical and obliterated without warning, their populations exterminated in Vandire's name. Yet in the darkest of times, hope remained. Vandire's enemies were gathering, and soon the Imperium would rise against him. But the path to Vandire's downfall would be paved with blood, for he would not relinquish his power easily. The Reign of Blood had consumed the galaxy, and it would take the strength of the Emperor's faithful to end it. As the Imperium continued to buckle under the weight of Goge Vandire's oppressive reign, his growing paranoia reached fevered heights. Each day, more of the Imperium's resources were funneled into his war machine, and more of its people were sacrificed to maintain his power. Whispers of rebellion continued to grow. These whispers found fertile ground within the Ecclesiarchy itself, where a deepening disillusionment had begun to take hold. Vandire's actions had long since crossed the line between order and tyranny, and many priests and officials within the church, who had once supported him, now began to question his legitimacy. But Vandire's grip on the Ecclesiarchy remained strong, and he was quick to respond to any signs of dissent. His spies moved swiftly, rooting out Thor's supporters wherever they could be found. Public executions became a daily occurrence, as Vandire sought to crush any opposition before it could gain momentum. Yet despite his best efforts, Thor's movement continued to grow. Thor's words spread through the galaxy, reaching the ears of those most weary of Vandire's reign. It was a call to action that could not be ignored, and soon, worlds once under Vandire's iron fist began to turn. Seditious uprisings flared up across the Imperium, and where Vandire's Frateris Templar and Sisters of Battle sought to crush these rebellions, they encountered greater resistance than they had anticipated. The rebellion began in the outer systems, far from Vandire's seat of power on Terra. Isolated worlds declared their allegiance to Thor, and their people took up arms against Vandire's forces. At first, Vandire dismissed these uprisings as the final throes of desperation. But the rebellion, unlike any other he had faced, continued to grow. It spread like wildfire, and soon even the core systems, those closest to Terra, began to falter in their loyalty. In response, Vandire unleashed his fury. He ordered the extermination of entire star systems, declaring them heretical and purging them with the full might of his forces. Planets were reduced to ash, and millions died in the name of maintaining his power. But for all the destruction Vandire wrought, he could not stamp out the spirit of resistance. The more worlds he burned, the more the people turned against him, and then came the moment that would break the stalemate. The Adeptus Mechanicus, long frustrated by Vandire's reckless destruction of their sacred technology, finally declared their neutrality, cutting off vital supplies to Vandire's war machine. Their support had long been the backbone of his power, but now they no longer served his cause. Even the Adeptus Astartes, the mighty space marines, could no longer remain silent. Their oaths were to the Emperor, not to Vandire's corrupted regime. Many chapters began to distance themselves from Vandire's rule, and some, seeing the devastation wrought in the Emperor's name, quietly aligned themselves with Thor's cause. The most prominent among them were the Black Templars, a chapter whose fervor for the Emperor's true word made them natural allies of Thor's movement. Though the Space Marines would not openly march on Terra, their support lent credibility to the rebellion, and the tide began to turn. It was during this time that one of the most significant and fateful events in the history of the Imperium occurred. Alicia Dominica, the revered leader of the Sisters of Battle, who had long served as Vandire's most trusted lieutenant, began to experience a crisis of faith. The horrors she had witnessed in Vandire's name, the countless innocents slaughtered, the endless bloodshed, had finally driven her to question whether Vandire was truly the Emperor's chosen. For years, Dominica had been one of Vandire's most loyal servants, believing in the righteousness of his cause. But now, doubt gnawed at her soul. It was then, as Dominica wrestled with her inner turmoil, that a miracle occurred. She was summoned to the throne room of the Emperor himself, an event that had not occurred for any mortal in millennia. Accompanied by her closest sisters, Dominica entered the sacred chamber where the Emperor, entombed upon the golden throne, continued to guide humanity through the warp. There, in the presence of the Emperor's psychic power, Dominica was granted a vision. What she saw in that vision remains a mystery to this day. Some say the Emperor spoke to her directly, revealing the truth of Vandire's heresy and the corruption that had taken hold of the Imperium. Others believe she was shown the true path of the Emperor's will, free from the chains of Vandire's madness. Whatever the truth, when Dominica and her sisters emerged from the throne room, they were changed. Their doubts were gone, replaced by a burning clarity and purpose. Dominica returned to Vandire's palace, but now her loyalty to him was shattered. She confronted Vandire, standing before the man who had ruled the Imperium through fear and deceit for so long. For the first time, Vandire's grip on his most loyal followers had slipped. His power was no longer absolute, and his time was running out. As Thor's influence spread, his message began to reach even the most isolated parts of the Imperium. Thor's followers smuggled his sermons across the galaxy, delivering them to worlds ravaged by Vandire's purges. His words gave hope to those who had lost everything, and slowly, the embers of rebellion began to burn brighter. Even among the Sisters of Battle, whispers of doubt began to surface. Vandire's absolute control over the Imperium was no longer as certain as it had once been. It was during this time that one of Vandire's most trusted lieutenants, Alicia Dominica, began to harbor her own doubts. Dominica was the leader of the Sisters of Battle, a fierce and uncompromising warrior whose faith in the Emperor was unshakable. She had fought at Vandire's side for years, believing in his divine mandate. But as the reign of blood dragged on and the horrors of Vandire's tyranny became impossible to ignore, Dominica found herself questioning whether Vandire truly served the Emperor's will. Dominica's growing disillusionment was compounded by the constant bloodshed. She had seen firsthand the devastation wrought by Vandire's purges, the countless innocents slaughtered in the name of rooting out heresy. For the first time, she began to wonder whether Vandire was the righteous leader he claimed to be, or whether he had simply manipulated the Ecclesiarchy to serve his own twisted desires. Yet Dominica's faith in the Emperor remained strong. She sought answers in prayer, hoping for guidance, but none came. Her doubts festered in silence, buried beneath the weight of her loyalty to Vandire and her commitment to the Sisters of Battle. But as more of Vandire's atrocities came to light, Dominica could no longer ignore the truth. Vandire's reign was built on lies. Meanwhile, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of Mars, had grown increasingly frustrated with Vandire's endless demands. Their role in the Imperium was to maintain the sacred technology of the Emperor, to preserve the ancient machines that kept the galaxy running. But Vandire, in his paranoia, had treated them as nothing more than tools for his war machine. Resources were drained, and holy relics were destroyed in his senseless campaigns of terror. The Fabricator General of Mars, the leader of the Adeptus Mechanicus, began to distance himself from Vandire's regime. Though the tech priests had long remained neutral in matters of imperial politics, Vandire's reckless disregard for their ancient technologies had pushed them to the breaking point. They could no longer stand by as Vandire's madness threatened the very foundations of the Imperium. The Adeptus Astartes, too, were growing restless. These superhuman warriors, the Space Marines, were the Emperor's most loyal servants, and they had fought to protect humanity for millennia. Yet Vandire's actions had sown chaos across the galaxy, weakening the Imperium's defenses and leaving entire systems vulnerable to attack. The Space Marines had long maintained their distance from the political machinations of terror, but as Vandire's reign dragged on, they could no longer ignore the threat he posed. As the forces of resistance quietly gathered, the Imperium teetered on the brink of civil war. Vandire, blind to the growing rebellion, continued his reign of terror, confident that his grip on power was unshakable. But his enemies were drawing closer, and the cracks in his regime were becoming too large to ignore. The turning point in Vandire's reign came in the form of a final decisive act of defiance, one that even his formidable forces could not suppress. Sebastian Thor, the preacher whose voice had become the rallying cry for the disillusioned and the faithful, called for a united rebellion. The turning point in Goge Vandire's reign of terror began with a single act of defiance. The Imperium, suffocating under the iron grip of Vandire's tyranny, was ready to explode. Worlds had been razed, populations decimated, and the fires of rebellion were stoked higher with each passing day. The final spark, however, came not from battle, but from a message, a call for unity and faith that would shake the very foundations of the Imperium. Sebastian Thor, now the living embodiment of resistance, made his final proclamation. His followers had grown vast, encompassing citizens, military officers, priests, and even the mighty Adeptus Mechanicus. His message was one of redemption, calling for the Imperium to return to the Emperor's true path, to cast down the heretic Vandire who had usurped the Emperor's will for his own gain. His call was simple but profound. Rise up in the Emperor's name and reclaim the Imperium for humanity. As Dominica and her sisters turned against Vandire, the rebellion reached its climax. The forces of Thor, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and even the Inquisition, who had remained neutral until now, moved to depose Vandire. Terror itself became a battleground, as the High Lords of Terror, once cowed by Vandire's iron will, began to openly defy him. The Imperium, long suffering under the Reign of Blood, was ready to reclaim its future. In the final days of Goge Vandire's reign, terror stood on the brink of civil war. The streets of the imperial palace ran red with the blood of loyalists and rebels alike, as Thor's forces made their final push toward Vandire's stronghold. Vandire, now fully consumed by his own madness, refused to relinquish power. He had spent years building his empire of terror, and he would not give it up easily. The High Lord barricaded himself within his palace, surrounded by what remained of his loyal Frateris Templar and the few sisters of battle who still followed him. But even those closest to him began to waver. Vandire's once absolute authority had crumbled, and the walls of his fortress were closing in. Sebastian Thor, leading the charge for the Imperium's redemption, approached the gates of Vandire's palace with a coalition of rebels, including Dominica and her sisters, now loyal to the Emperor alone. The Adeptus Mechanicus had shut down Vandire's war machines, and the Adeptus Astartes had taken up strategic positions across Terra, ready to strike should Vandire attempt one last act of defiance. Within the palace, Vandire raved about betrayal and heresy, declaring himself the Emperor's chosen and cursing all who opposed him. But his words fell on deaf ears. The Imperium had seen through his lies, and now even his most fervent followers turned away from him. The tide had turned irrevocably against the madman who had once held the galaxy in thrall. In the final moments of his life, Vandire's madness reached its peak. Refusing to surrender, he continued to claim divine authority, but his delusions were shattered when Dominica herself stormed into the throne room. With the authority granted to her by the Emperor, she condemned Vandire as a traitor and heretic. His reign, which had bathed the Imperium in blood, ended as she struck him down, bringing an end to the Reign of Blood. Sebastian Thor emerged from the conflict as a hero, a symbol of the Emperor's true will. Vandire's death marked the beginning of a new era for the Imperium, though the scars of his reign would take millennia to heal. The Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, would rise from the ashes of Vandire's corruption, becoming the Emperor's most devout protectors. And Thor himself would be canonized as a saint, remembered for his unwavering faith in the Emperor's light. The Imperium had been saved, but at a terrible cost. The Reign of Blood would forever be remembered as one of the darkest chapters in the history of mankind, a time when corruption and tyranny nearly destroyed the Emperor's realm. Yet from that darkness, a new light had emerged, a light that would guide the Imperium through the trials and tribulations yet to come.